Jake Mitchell never picked fights. He believed in minding his own business, running his farm, and letting the world do as it pleased. But sometimes, trouble doesn't come knocking. It marches straight up to your front door, clipboard in hand, and demands a war. It started like any other morning. The sun was barely up, the air smelled of damp earth, and the distant crow of a rooster signaled the start of another workday. Jake sat on his porch, coffee in hand, enjoying the kind of peace only the countryside could offer. Then, he saw the car. Sleek, shiny, completely out of place on his dusty driveway. It rolled up slow, deliberate, like it belonged here. Jake already had a bad feeling. And when the driver's door opened, he knew this wasn't a friendly visit. A woman stepped out, dressed like she was headed to a corporate meeting, not a farm. Perfect beige suit, clipboard held tight against her chest, and a look that said she had already decided she didn't like what she saw. She walked with purpose, ignoring the uneven ground, her heels sinking slightly into the dirt. Jake didn't move. He just took another sip of his coffee and waited. The woman reached his porch and plastered on a tight smile. The kind people use when they are pretending to be polite. "Mr. Mitchell." Jake set his mug down. "That's me." The smile stayed, but her eyes flickered with irritation. "Karen Whitmore. I'm the president of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association." Jake didn't answer right away. He just glanced past her, toward the neat little rows of houses in the distance. Crestwood Estates. A neighborhood that hadn't even existed 5 years ago, now acting like it owned the land it sat on. Finally, he looked back at her. "And what can I do for the HOA?" Karen's smile thinned. "I wanted to have a quick discussion about your property." That's when Jake knew this wasn't a friendly chat. This was a battle in disguise. The morning after Karen's visit, Jake found a crisp white envelope tucked into his mailbox. The HOA's logo was stamped in the top left corner, looking all official. He smirked as he tore it open. Inside was a formal notice. "Dear Mr. Mitchell, it has come to our attention that your property is in violation of Crestwood Estates community standards. Immediate action is required to maintain the aesthetic and environmental quality of our neighborhood." Jake skimmed the rest, shaking his head. According to the letter, his barn's color was disruptive to community harmony, his rooster was causing unreasonable noise pollution, and his farm animals were creating an undesirable environment. He let out a chuckle, pinned the letter to his fridge like a trophy, and went about his day. But Karen wasn't done. The next week, another letter arrived. This one was even more dramatic, warning that continued failure to comply could lead to further action. Jake chuckled again and added it to the fridge collection. Then the calls started. Apparently, someone, wonder who, had been reporting him to the county for various violations. One day, it was a complaint about improper waste disposal. The next, it was potential health hazards due to livestock. Then, unpermitted structures on the property. One by one, the inspectors showed up. First came the county health department. A man in a city-issued uniform knocked on Jake's door while jotting something onto a clipboard. "Got a report about potential contamination issues with your livestock." Jake motioned toward his barn. "Be my guest." The inspector checked the pens, water supply, and storage areas. After a thorough look, he nodded. "Everything's up to code. No issues here." Next was zoning enforcement. Another official, another clipboard. "We received a concern about unapproved expansions to your structures." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You mean my 60-year-old barn?" The inspector sighed. "Yeah, seems that way." After a quick check, he confirmed what Jake already knew, no violations. Then came animal welfare. A woman in a polo with a county badge arrived, looking concerned. "There's been a complaint about neglected and mistreated animals." Jake led her to the pasture, where his cows lazily chewed cud and his chickens strutted about. His dog greeted her with a wagging tail. She scanned the area, then sighed. "This place is better maintained than most registered farms I've seen." Jake crossed his arms. Figured as much. After that, the visits stopped. Word must have spread among county officials because the last inspector, an older man named Roger, shook his head as he walked up. "I don't know who you pissed off," he said, "but they've got us running in circles. This is the cleanest farm I've inspected in months." Jake chuckled. "Wouldn't happen to be someone from the HOA sending you, would it?" Roger sighed, lowering his voice. "Off the record, it's the same name on every complaint." Jake wasn't surprised. Karen was relentless, but now, she had a problem. He wasn't breaking any laws. For a few days, Things were quiet. No letters, no surprise visits. He almost thought Karen had given up. Then she showed up in person. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 HOA board members flanked her, their faces set in the same self-important scowl. Jake, who was mid-repair on a fence post, wiped his hands on a rag and met them at the property line. Back again. Karen let out an exaggerated sigh. Mr. Mitchell, we were hoping to resolve this amicably, but you continue to ignore our requests. Jake crossed his arms. That's because your requests are ridiculous. Karen's eyes narrowed, but she kept her tone even. As per HOA regulations. Jake cut her off. I'm not in your HOA. She cleared her throat. As per community standards, all properties within visible range of Crestwood Estates must meet neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. We are prepared to take further action if necessary. Jake let out a slow chuckle. Lady, you're not my landlord. You don't have any authority here. One of the board members, a wiry man with thick-rimmed glasses, stepped forward. We've been in contact with county officials regarding zoning laws. If your farm is found to be in violation of certain regulations, you may be subject to fines. Jake's amusement faded just slightly. He knew his farm was in full compliance, but he also knew people like Karen. They'd dig and dig, looking for any excuse to make his life miserable. He took a step closer. You go ahead and do what you have to do. But if you or anyone from your HOA so much as steps foot on my land again, I'll be calling the sheriff for trespassing. Karen's expression cracked for just a moment, frustration flickering behind her eyes, before she masked it with her usual forced politeness. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be, she said. Jake didn't even blink. No, Karen. You are. With that, he turned his back on them and walked away, leaving them standing there, speechless. He could almost hear Karen's teeth grinding as she stormed back to her car. This wasn't over. He knew it, and so did she. Jake had seen a lot of nonsense in his life, but this was something else. He was out fixing a section of his fence when he heard the sound of power tools buzzing from the far end of his property. At first, he thought maybe one of his neighbors was doing some work, but as he walked closer, his stomach tightened. A group of workers in bright vests were hammering stakes into the ground, on his land. They weren't fixing anything. They were building a fence. And standing off to the side, clipboard in hand, looking far too pleased with herself, was Karen. Jake's boots crunched against the dirt as he strode over. What the hell is this? Karen turned, her fake surprise almost impressive. Oh, Mr. Mitchell. Just the person I wanted to see. Jake folded his arms. You mind telling me why you're putting up a fence on my land? Karen's smile didn't waver. It's not your land. After reviewing older property maps, the HOA has determined that this section actually falls within our community boundary. We're simply reclaiming what belongs to us. Jake let out a slow, measured breath. You determined that, huh? She nodded. For the good of the neighborhood, of course. This fence will create a clear divide between our beautiful community and... She waved a hand toward his farm. This. Jake clenched his jaw. You got a permit for this. One of the workers hesitated, shifting on his feet. Karen, however, didn't flinch. We're handling it through the proper channels. Jake stepped closer. That's not what I asked. Do you have a permit right now? Silence. Karen cleared her throat. The HOA has full authority to manage the borders of its community. Jake scoffed. Lady, you don't have authority over a single inch of my land. He turned his attention to the workers. And unless you want to be charged with trespassing, I'd suggest you pack up your tools and leave. Now. One of the workers looked over at Karen, waiting for her to say something. She forced a laugh, trying to keep control. Mr. Mitchell, there's no need to escalate this. Jake pulled out his phone. I'll just let the sheriff sort it out. That got their attention. The workers immediately started gathering their things, muttering amongst themselves. They weren't about to get dragged into some legal mess over an HOA dispute. Karen's face hardened. You're being unreasonable. Jake raised an eyebrow. I'm unreasonable? You just tried to steal my land. She let out a frustrated huff. This isn't over. Jake smirked. Yeah, I figured. She turned sharply, marching back to her car. But this time, she wasn't strutting. She was fuming. Jake watched as the last of the workers packed up and drove off. This was beyond petty HOA rules now. Karen wasn't just trying to control him. She was trying to take what was his. And he wasn't going to let that happen. Jake stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand, ready to start his day. The sun was barely up, the air crisp, and everything felt normal, until his eyes landed on something that nearly made him drop his mug. Right there, planted near the road at the edge of his property, was a for sale sign. And not just any sign. A professionally printed real estate sign, complete with an under negotiation banner slapped across it, as if someone was in the middle of buying his land. Jake stared at it for a long moment, letting his brain catch up. Then he set his coffee down, marched across the yard, and ripped the sign straight out of the ground. What kind of game was this? Before he could even process how insane this was, a familiar car pulled up, stopping just short of where the sign had been. Karen stepped out, all smiles, as if nothing was wrong. "Oh, good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she chirped, her voice syrupy sweet. "I see you've noticed the sign. There's been a bit of a mix-up, but I'm sure we can clear this up." Jake held up the sign. "You want to explain why the hell there's a for sale sign on my land?" Karen placed a hand on her chest, feigning concern. "Oh dear, I was hoping to catch you before you saw that. There's been a misunderstanding. You see, we at the HOA have been discussing property expansions, and some local realtors assumed your farm was included." Jake's fingers tightened around the wooden post. "Assumed? So, what, you just accidentally listed my farm for sale?" Karen let out a nervous laugh. "It's not quite like that. There was just some enthusiasm about potential development opportunities. You understand?" Jake's jaw clenched. "Let me get this straight. You, who have zero control over my property, told a real estate agent that my farm was up for sale." Karen's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, when you put it that way, it sounds much worse than it actually is." Jake took a deep breath, shoving the sign under his arm. "Tell whoever put this up to never step foot on my land again." Karen held up a hand. Now, let's not be hasty. If you'd be open to negotiations." Jake pulled out his phone. "I'll tell you what I'm open to. Calling the county and reporting fraudulent real estate activity." That got her attention. Her expression flickered, just for a second, before she plastered on another fake smile. "There's no need for that," she said quickly. "I'll handle the mix-up." Jake tilted his head. "You do that. Because if I see another sign like this, I won't just be calling the county, I'll be talking to a lawyer." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. Without another word, she turned on her heel and got back into her car. Jake watched as she sped off, tires kicking up dust. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. This wasn't just a power struggle anymore. Karen was playing dirty. But if she thought he was going to roll over, she had another thing coming. Jake had put up with a lot, but after Karen tried to sell his land out from under him, he decided it was time to push back. Not with legal threats, not with arguments, with pure, glorious, petty revenge. It started with the rooster. Karen had so many complaints about it waking people up too early. So, Jake did the only reasonable thing. He got more. Not one, not two, 3 new roosters joined the farm, making a grand total of 4. He even made sure they were the loudest ones he could find. By 5 a.m. sharp, the farm came alive with an absolute symphony of crowing. The sound carried right into Crestwood Estates, bouncing off their pristine homes like an alarm clock they never set. Jake sat on his porch, sipping his coffee, enjoying the sweet, sweet irony. It didn't take long for the first call. Karen's voice was sharp on the other end. "This is harassment, Jake." Jake chuckled. "Nah, just nature doing what it does. You can't seriously need that many roosters." "Well, you know, one might oversleep. Gotta have backups." She hung up. But that was just the beginning. Next came the sunflowers. Karen had made it clear that his farm was an eyesore for her perfect neighborhood. So, Jake decided to improve the view. He bought hundreds of sunflower seeds and spent the next few days planting them right along the property line. A full row, stretching as far as the eye could see. By the time they grew, they stood tall, golden, and absolutely unmissable. Now, instead of looking at the ugly farm, Crestwood residents got to see a massive wall of bright yellow flowers blocking their scenic views. Jake even made a sign. "Enjoy the view, courtesy of Mitchell Farms." Karen was livid. She showed up at his fence, fists clenched. "You did this on purpose." Jake smiled. "Landscaping. Thought you'd appreciate it." She stomped away, but he wasn't done yet. Next, he went for the big move. Karen and the HOA wanted quiet, order, and control. So Jake did the opposite. He called up his buddy Mason, who ran the local farmers market, and made a suggestion. Why don't we host a weekly event at my farm? And just like that, Farmers Fun Day was born. Flyers went up all over town. Come meet the animals. Buy fresh produce. Enjoy live music. Free entry. The first Saturday, dozens of families showed up. Kids ran around, petting goats. Parents bought fresh eggs and milk. Local musicians set up a small live band right by the barn. It was loud. It was busy. It was an absolute nightmare for Karen. By noon, she was storming up his driveway, clipboard in hand. This is a violation of multiple community guidelines. Jake leaned against a fence post. Not part of your community. She scowled. This is disturbing the peace. Jake gestured at the families laughing, shopping, and having a great time. Looks peaceful to me. Her face turned red. I'm calling the cops. Go for it. And she did. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's car pulled up. The deputy stepped out, tipped his hat at Jake. Got a complaint about a disturbance. Jake grinned. Looks more like a family gathering to me. Karen, red-faced and fuming, jabbed a finger toward the band. This is an unauthorized event. It's disrupting our neighborhood. The sheriff gave her a bored look. This is private property. Nothing illegal going on here. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. But the noise. He shrugged. No laws against playing music on your own land. Jake crossed his arms. Guess that settles it. Karen stomped off without another word. Jake shook the sheriff's hand. Appreciate you coming out. No problem. Just keep having a good time. And with that, Farmers Fun Day became a permanent event. Every week, more people showed up. It became so popular that even some HOA members started coming by to shop. Karen had lost. And Jake? He was just getting started. Karen had always ruled the HOA with an iron grip. She was the type who fined people for having the wrong shade of beige on their house. The kind who measured grass height with a ruler. For years, the homeowners grumbled but never pushed back, until now. Jake's farm feud wasn't just some petty dispute anymore. It had turned into a full-blown community war. And to Karen's surprise, she was losing. It started with whispers. A few Crestwood residents, tired of Karen's antics, began questioning her leadership. They saw what she was doing to Jake, and for the first time, they realized they could be next. One of them, Linda Matthews, had been on the HOA board before Karen forced her out. One afternoon, she showed up at Jake's farm, a fresh-baked pie in hand. You don't know it yet, Jake, she said, setting the pie on his porch railing. But you're doing the Lord's work. Jake raised an eyebrow. Didn't think HOA folks were the pie-gifting type. Linda snorted. Oh, please. Not all of us are crazy. You think I enjoyed getting fined because my grandkids drew with chalk on my driveway. She shook her head. People are sick of her. You've got more support than you think. And she wasn't bluffing. A few days later, an anonymous manila envelope showed up in Jake's mailbox. No return address, just his name scribbled on the front. Inside, copies of internal HOA emails. Karen had been faking complaints under different names to flood county offices with reports against Jake. She knew the authorities would ignore her if they saw the HOA was behind all of them, so she created fake residents, phony signatures, made-up concerns, all designed to make it look like the entire community wanted Jake gone. And it got worse. Another email revealed Karen had pushed for a special assessment, a one-time HOA fee that every homeowner would have to pay. What was it for? To fund her legal battle against Jake. She was trying to make the entire neighborhood pay for her personal vendetta. Jake let out a low whistle. Now that's bold. That night, Greg, a veteran who lived in Crestwood, showed up on Jake's porch with a grin. You're gonna love this. He slid over another folder. These are the minutes from the last HOA board meeting, Greg said, chuckling. Karen was trying to get the board to approve the legal fees. Didn't go well. Jake skimmed through the pages, and there it was, residents were pushing back. One board member had flat out refused, calling it a waste of resources on a personal issue. Another warned that this could lead to lawsuits against the HOA. For the first time, Karen wasn't in full control. The tide was shifting. And the final nail in the coffin? People started publicly complaining. One Crestwood resident took to the neighborhood Facebook group. I don't even like the farm, but if I have to choose between hearing a rooster or paying for Karen's lawsuit, I'll take the damn rooster. Another chimed in. This HOA was supposed to make our lives easier, not fund personal grudges. Karen tried to silence the growing dissent, but it was too late. Board members started ignoring her emails. Residents who once feared her openly questioned her decisions. And just like that, Karen's power was crumbling. But Jake knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going down without a fight. Jake had seen Karen pull some wild stunts, but this one took the cake. He woke up early, just like always, ready to start his day. But as he drove down his long gravel driveway, something caught his eye. A brand new sign stood at the entrance to his road. Private road, no trespassing, HOA property. Jake hit the brakes, staring at it in disbelief. His road, the public road that had been there longer than Crestwood Estates had even existed, Karen had claimed it as private property. Jake clenched his jaw. She was getting desperate. He didn't bother calling her. He called the county. An hour later, a county official pulled up, stepping out of his truck with a clipboard. Jake pointed at the sign. "Tell me that's legal." The official let out a low whistle. "Yeah, no, that's completely illegal." "Who put it up?" Jake crossed his arms. "Who do you think?" The official sighed. "I should have known." He made a call, and within 2 hours, a road crew arrived. They didn't ask questions. They just ripped the signs out of the ground and loaded them into a truck. Jake stood by, arms folded, watching it all happen. Then, right on cue, Karen's car sped down the street, tires screeching to a stop. She stepped out, furious. "What do you think you're doing?" The county official barely looked up. "Removing illegal signage." Karen's face turned red. "That's HOA property. You can't just—" "It's not HOA property," the official interrupted. "This is a county-maintained public road. Your association has no authority over it." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But, this was approved by the board." The official shook his head. "I don't care who approved it. You have no right to block a public road." Jake couldn't help but smirk. "Tough break, Karen." Karen spun toward him, eyes blazing. "You did this." Jake shrugged. "Nah, the law did." The official wasn't done. He pulled out a notepad and started writing. Karen's expression faltered. What are you doing?" He tore off a slip and handed it to her. "This is a formal warning. If you or the HOA attempt to interfere with county roads again, you'll be facing legal action." Karen stared at the paper as if it personally offended her. "This is ridiculous." The official didn't blink. "What's ridiculous is trying to claim land that isn't yours." She stormed back to her car, slamming the door so hard the whole vehicle shook. As she sped off, Jake let out a low chuckle. Karen was running out of moves. And she knew it. Karen had been dodging fire for weeks, but now the flames were closing in. The illegal roadblock stunt was the last straw for many Crestwood residents. People who had once feared her now openly questioned her leadership. Homeowners who never dared to speak up before were suddenly fed up. That's when Greg, the retired veteran who had been quietly helping Jake, decided to push things over the edge. He called for an emergency HOA meeting. Normally, these meetings were dry, uneventful affairs, with Karen running the show, barking orders, and enforcing pointless rules. But this time, the room was packed. People who had never attended an HOA meeting in their lives showed up, ready for a fight. Some brought printed emails, others carried copies of the fake complaints Karen had filed against Jake. Jake didn't even need to go. The community was about to handle Karen all on their own. The moment the meeting started, Richard, the HOA president, stood up. Normally a quiet man who let Karen run things, tonight he looked exhausted. "Let's get straight to it," he said, rubbing his forehead. "We have received multiple complaints, real complaints, about how this HOA has been operating. More specifically, about Karen." Karen sat at the head of the table, her arms crossed. "This is absurd." Richard ignored her. "We now have proof that multiple false complaints were submitted to the county. We have documents showing HOA funds were almost used for a private lawsuit against a resident who isn't even part of this HOA. And worst of all," he pulled out a paper and held it up, "we have a formal county warning for attempting to claim public land." Murmurs spread through the room. Karen's face turned red. "This is ridiculous. I did what was best for the neighborhood." Linda, the woman who had been kicked off the board years ago, stood up. "No, Karen," she said, her voice firm. "You did what was best for you." Another resident spoke up. "I got fined for having my trash can out too early. But Karen's been wasting HOA money trying to fight a farm." Another voice joined in. "She made us pay for new signs after calling Jake's place an eyesore. Now look at our entrance. It's worse than before." The crowd grew louder. Greg finally stepped forward, dropping a thick folder onto the table. I got emails. HOA records. Proof that Karen has been abusing her position. We don't need to talk about this anymore. We need to vote. Karen's chair scraped against the floor as she stood up fast. You can't do this. I've given everything to this HOA. I built this community. Richard sighed. Karen, sit down. She didn't. She glared at everyone like they had betrayed her. But the truth was, they were never really on her side. They were just afraid of her. And now, that fear was gone. Let's vote, Richard said, his voice final. All in favor of removing Karen Whitmore from her position as HOA enforcer. A sea of hands went up. Karen's mouth fell open. You can't be serious. Richard looked around. All opposed. Silence. Karen was done. She slammed her clipboard onto the table. Fine, she snapped. You'll regret this. This place will fall apart without me. Nobody said a word. With a deep breath, Richard picked up a paper from the stack in front of him. As of today, you are no longer authorized to make decisions on behalf of this HOA, he said. You have 1 week to remove your personal items from the HOA office. Karen stormed out. But her humiliation wasn't over yet. The very next morning, a for sale sign appeared in front of her house. She hadn't just lost her position. She was leaving. Some said she was pressured into it. Others believed she simply couldn't stand living in a place where she had no power. Either way, Karen was gone. And for the first time in years, Crestwood Estates felt free. Karen's reign was over, her influence shattered in a single night. The very people she had controlled for years had turned against her, and now, she had no choice but to leave. A week after she was voted out, a moving truck pulled up in front of her house. Neighbors watched from their porches, some whispering, others openly grinning. The woman who had dictated the height of their hedges and the color of their mailboxes was packing up and leaving. Jake didn't go over to gloat. He didn't need to. Crestwood Estates had already won. With Karen gone, the HOA relaxed. The ridiculous fines stopped. The constant threats disappeared. People who had spent years walking on eggshells in their own neighborhood finally felt at ease. And Jake, he went back to enjoying his farm. But karma wasn't done with Karen yet. A month later, Jake got a call from Greg. Man, you are not gonna believe this. Jake leaned against his truck. Try me. She moved into another HOA. Jake smirked. Of course, she did. Greg chuckled. It gets better. She tried to take over, same as before. Thought she could boss people around like she did here. Jake already knew where this was going. Let me guess. Didn't work out. Greg laughed. The new HOA already has an enforcer. And this guy, way worse than she ever was. Jake shook his head. That's poetic. Oh, it gets even better, Greg said, barely containing his amusement. She got fined. For parking too close to the curb. Then again for not having HOA-approved flowers in her yard. Then, get this, they wrote her up for having the wrong shade of beige on her house. Jake burst out laughing. Karen had spent years making people's lives miserable over tiny rules, and now, she was on the receiving end of the same nonsense. She's trying to fight it, Greg added. But nobody cares. They love their HOA rules over there. Jake wiped a tear from his eye. That's the funniest thing I've heard all year. She put her house up for sale again. Jake nearly doubled over. That fast? Yep. Looks like she can't handle what she spent years dishing out. Jake shook his head, still grinning. That's karma for you. And with that, he hung up. He never saw Karen again, but every now and then, he'd hear little updates. How she kept moving from place to place, never staying long enough to plant roots. Meanwhile, Jake's farm thrived. His weekly market turned into a town favorite. Families came from all over to buy fresh produce, pet the animals, and enjoy the music. Even some old HOA members became regulars, happy to support the farm they once tried to shut down. And just for good measure, Jake put up a brand new sign at the edge of his property. Welcome to Mitchell Farms. HOA free since 1923. It became a town landmark. People stopped to take pictures with it. Some even joked about making it a tourist attraction. Karen had tried to destroy him, but in the end, she was the one who lost everything. Jake just sat back on his porch, sipped his coffee, and enjoyed the view. With Karen gone, everything changed. Crestwood Estates, once a neighborhood ruled by fear of fines and complaint letters, finally breathed easy. The HOA, under new leadership, stopped micromanaging every little thing. The pointless rules. Gone. The constant threats. Over. People could finally live their lives without worrying about the color of their mailbox or the height of their grass. And Jake. He thrived. The weekly farmers market that started as a small event exploded into a full-fledged community gathering. More vendors joined in, local musicians performed, and people came from miles away just to spend their Saturdays at Mitchell Farms. Even former HOA members, people who once sided with Karen, started showing up, happily buying fresh eggs and produce. One afternoon, Linda and a few others arrived, carrying a basket of fresh-baked bread. "We figured we owed you a proper apology," Linda said, handing it over. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Never thought I'd see the day when an HOA member brought me a peace offering." Linda chuckled. "Let's just say things are a little different now." Another resident, Ted, scratched his head. "Honestly, Jake, most of us never had a problem with your farm. We just didn't want to end up on Karen's hit list." Jake smirked. "Understandable." Linda nodded. "Now that she's gone, we were hoping for a fresh start. No more fighting." Jake considered it for a moment, then took a bite of the bread. "Well," he said, chewing thoughtfully, "as long as nobody tries to tell me what color to paint my barn again, I think we can call it even." They all laughed. And just like that, years of hostility faded away. But karma. It wasn't quite done with Karen. A few weeks later, news spread through town that she had tried to take over another HOA in a different neighborhood. But this time, she wasn't the one calling the shots. The new HOA was even stricter than she had ever been. They fined her for parking too close to the curb, for having the wrong shade of beige on her house, for leaving her garbage bin out for 5 extra minutes. Within a month, she put her house up for sale. She had spent years controlling people through rules and fines, and now, she was trapped in her own nightmare. Meanwhile, Jake's farm kept growing. To celebrate his final victory, he put up a brand new sign at the edge of his property. "Welcome to Mitchell Farms, HOA free since 1923. It became a town landmark. People stopped to take pictures. Some even joked that it should be on a postcard. Karen had tried to tear him down, but in the end, Jake won. And as he sat on his porch, sipping his coffee, watching his farm thrive, he couldn't help but smile. Because some people never learn. But karma always does its job.